Hi, I'm Martha. Welcome to my sewing studio. This is part 3 of sewing a wool winter coat. In my previous videos in this series, I talked about all the materials you'll want to gather together for this kind of project. And I also reviewed my pattern tissue and looked at the instructions and all of the techniques that are in store for us. Today I'm doing what I call prep work, which includes cutting out my fabric, installing the interfacing, and I'm also doing a few things like stay stitching and applying stay tape. Once my fabric is cut out, there's no going back. I'm going to be all in on this project, and the pace of my project will really pick up. There will be a lot more sewing techniques and sitting at the machine. So that's something for us to look forward to. And of course, I am going to be hand sewing sequins onto this coat. Stay tuned until the end of this video where I will talk through what is to come in terms of the pacing and techniques that I'll be showing in my upcoming videos. If you want to jump around through the techniques I'm using today, I will put timestamps in the description box below. I'm pretty eager to get going, so let's dive in. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is cut my fashion fabric, in my case, my alpaca boucle. And while I have this beautiful cutting table, my fabric is longer than the cutting table, and before I cut anything out, I want to make sure I have taken every precaution that all of my pieces fit. So I'm going to put my fabric on the floor and lay everything out and really think about it, make sure it's an efficient and correct use of fabric, make sure all of the pieces are cut with the grain line correctly laid, and only then will I begin cutting. I've assembled my favorite cutting tools, and I will link my favorite tools in the description box below, but I have 2 pairs of shears. I prefer to cut with scissors, and also my rotary cutter because sometimes it does do the best, but I find with a thick fabric like this, it can kind of smush things and they'll get distorted, whereas really sharp scissors will just go straight through. I also have my biggest quilting ruler. I find this to be the ideal tool for finding the grain line because it can go pretty far across the width of your fabric, or you could lay it parallel to the selvage, things like that. There's a lot of nice ways to use this. I also have my favorite quilting pins. Obviously, I'm not doing any quilting, but these pins are designed to go through a quilt, so a thick, bulky fabric. They work really great for coating as well. I highly recommend these for this kind of project. Okay, I think I'm gonna get down on the floor now. Let's go. You can see here that everything fits with absolutely no room to spare. I had 3 yards and 8 inches, so 3 1/4 yards exactly. The edges were not cut completely flush. You can see there's a little unevenness here, but not a big deal. Easy to work with. It was truly exactly the right amount of fabric. The only piece that I have not pinned is my welt, and that's because I'm still debating if I'll make it bigger. I wasn't sure if I'd have room if I made it bigger, but I think that I will. So I'm gonna wait until tomorrow to cut things out, and I will make a decision around my welt pocket bag and my welt before cutting. Otherwise, I think everything is just squeezed in here, but I like to sleep on it before cutting things out in case something comes to mind that I haven't thought of yet. most of my pieces are cut out. Still have them pinned to the tissue. I also have my hair canvas strips for the hem. And when I was cutting, I changed the back facing, so I'll need to keep this in mind when I cut out my lining. One thing I almost forgot to mention is how important it is to mark your pattern. My pattern has a lot of notches. It also has some helpfully placed dots. A lot of them are just at intersections, and it's nice to have that marked on your fabric if you want to sew with a lot of precision. A really textured wool fabric can be a lot harder to mark than something like a white cotton lawn. Remember that you have those scraps and take one out and do some tests. Personally, I like to use tailor's chalk for this kind of fabric. You can see that it marks clearly, but not super precisely. For me, that's okay. That's going to be good enough. And I want to remind you that not all chalks will rub out of your fabric. This one has like some wax in it so that it's going to stay in there, and that may or may not work well for your fabric. Again, do some tests. You might want to iron it, see what happens when you press it with steam, that type of thing. But this works great for me. The other option that you absolutely cannot go wrong with is tailor's tacks. Regardless of how you decide to do it, make sure you're marking everything, because the notches are going to come in handy as you're putting this together, especially places like your neckline where you really do need a certain level of precision as you work. Up next, I need to cut out interfacing, and I wanted to start with my hair canvas, and I have just enough to squeeze it out. This is the cuff interfacing piece, and then I also need to fit this on here. I think I was being a little too optimistic thinking that I could fit it. It doesn't quite fit. However, I know that for this piece I'm going to be removing the seam allowances, so I'm going to trace this off without the seam allowances and see if it'll just. So much as I hate tracing, I'm going to do that. I think it will work. Here's my pattern piece minus the seam allowances. That's what I'm missing. I'm gonna go for it. I'm okay with this level of fudging. All right, I've cut out my fashion fabric, my alpaca boucle, and then I just cut out my hair canvas. And as you saw, I was like the tiniest bit short on material. Sewing is a problem-solving activity, so I want to encourage you to not let being short on like ½ an inch of material to derail you. You just have to keep moving forward, and we are going to problem solve that when we get to it. The part where it's missing is a little corner, so I don't actually think it's going to be a big deal. I'll be pad stitching this, which is a hand sewing technique, so while I'm in there hand sewing, I could patch in a little triangle of my excess fabric, and that's just a really easy solution. Anytime you're hand sewing, you have maximum control. Just stitch it in there very carefully, make sure it gets the job done. It will be inside of a collar, fully enclosed, and no one will know but you. Speaking of scraps, I have saved every little morsel of my boucle. We are going to use these scraps throughout this project for a variety of things. First of all, if you're joining me in making bound buttonholes, you will need to cut out rectangles of this fabric to make the lips of your buttonholes. So make sure that you know the grain of your fabric. I can easily see the warp and weft on all of these scraps, so the grain is easy for me to identify. But if that's not the case with your fabric, if you have a selvage or if you have a piece of the fold, you will know where your grain is going. So that's going to be helpful if you're making bound buttonholes. You're also going to want scraps for various tests. You might want to test your interfacing. Make sure it's adhering, or make sure it's the thickness that you want it to be. Speaking of thickness, there will be times in this project where you're sewing over a lot of layers of fabric. When we're installing the collar, it's probably going to be 4 layers of fabric and maybe even some seam allowances in there, taking it up to like 6 layers of fabric. And yes, that's very thick, that's very bulky, and your machine might hate it. Wouldn't you prefer to work out any of those issues on some scrap rather than on your good fabric that's cut out for your project that you can't replace? You would. So if you're working through something and you think, I might get a thread nest, or my machine might not like this top stitching thread, or any of the things that could happen, work it out here first. The other thing that's important to practice on scraps is pressing, and we will get to this when we get into sewing. Pressing is a big part of every sewing project, but when you're sewing a wool coat, you're manipulating the fabric with steam at several points, and it's crucial that you know what you're doing. It is possible to overpress your fabric and it will get compacted and compressed. Something like this, the boucle will get smushed down. Some fabrics will become kind of shiny and they look like old and worn. It looks bad. You can try to kind of brush it back out, but the damage is usually done. Make sure that you practice pressing on some scraps, again, before on your project. All right, the last thing for me to cut out today is my cotton muslin, which I'm using as my sew-in interfacing. As for my lining, personally, I cut my lining later in the project. If you are someone who's like, if I don't cut it now, it's not happening, cut it now, cut out your lining. But personally, I like to wait because I will assemble the shell of the coat and try it on, and let's say I think I'd like to take this in 1/2 inch at the side seams, or I have wide seam allowances, I'm gonna let it out a little bit. I would prefer to have that in mind and cut out my lining already knowing those adjustments rather than having to adjust it on the fly. It's just my preferred workflow. I actually don't foresee myself making big changes to my lining, but that's just typically how I do this, so I'm going to stick with it on this project as well. I'm checking back in with my instructions to see the order of construction here, and they really get right into it in a way that I respect, because you do need to make your bound buttonholes kind of right off the bat. The sew-in interfacing is applied with some basting along the edges, but a lot of it is just sewn in to the seam and then trimmed away later. And I love that there's some supplementary instruction around trimming and correct pressing. Great. I feel like I really need to just get into it. So what I'm going to do next is clean my sewing machine, put in a fresh needle. I invite you to join me on that. I'm sewing on my Bernina 735, which uses a Bernina 7 series bobbin. It's a jumbo bobbin, so this won't run out very quickly, but I probably will go through like a little bit more than one bobbin on this project. We'll see. This machine has a front-loading bobbin and a sensor, so it will tell me when my bobbin is running low, and you don't have to remove your project. You can leave it here when the bobbin is low and open the front, swap out your bobbin, and continue sewing. It's wonderful. Okay, I cleaned and oiled my machine and I put in a new needle and I wound myself 2 bobbins, and I'm gonna go ahead and make a couple of swatches. I just wanna sew through a couple of scraps, see how that feels on the machine. And I think I'm gonna swap out my foot for a walking foot. With such a bouncy plush fabric, it's going to make sure that both layers of fabric feed evenly. It's gonna be the best result. I also think I'm gonna lengthen my stitch length to about 3 or 3 1/4. So I'll test that out as well. I recommend you also make some swatches. You really can't go wrong with a walking foot on a project like this. That felt good. Needle went through here easily, had a nice even feed, and I'm gonna press this now, hit it with some steam. You can see that my seam allowances kind of want to bounce up, and I will show you my thoughts on that in a moment. Sewing swatches is a very important step when you're using a new to you fabric or you're making something that's a big special project. Here's the one I just sewed, and I ended up deciding not to serge the edges of this. While my fabric does have a tendency to come unraveled if you kind of pull at it, I think that within a lining and within a project it will be safe, especially with these 5/8 of an inch seam allowances. It's a generous amount. I don't think it's going to unravel 5/8 of an inch worth when it's protected. I've steamed this and I pressed it lightly with my clapper. The seam allowances lay nice and flat, which I love to see. That being said, sometimes across a long seam or a curved seam, they'll kind of go like this within a project. This is a real bugaboo of mine, and so I like to very lightly and loosely catch stitch my seam allowances down. Not everyone's going to do that, and not every fabric requires it, but I think I will do this for some of the seams inside of my coat. So I made a test of it, and as long as you're taking your little bite of the seam allowance in from the edge, maybe a 1/4 inch in from the edge, it's safe. It's not going to unravel. And these stitch marks do not show through on the face of the fabric. You can't tell, and they're loose, so they're not pulling on anything as the garment moves. Then my last swatch is one that I sewed on the bias. I just wanted to see how the fabric would behave, how it would feed with my walking foot, and you know what? Looks great. Pressed really well, is not coming unraveled. So these are successful swatches. As we get further into the project, these will come in handy because I could do things like practice top stitching on these or practice sewing sequins and seeing how I want to tie the knots on the back of the sequins, things like that. So these will come in handy over the course of the project. Like I said before, the pattern kind of just has you dive in. So I'm going to dive in. I'm going to start by basting my interfacing pieces into my wool as shown here. There's going to be a little bit of seam binding applied as well. These center front pieces in particular have hand sewing, so that's where I'm going to start. It's raining cats and dogs and I've been sewing. I'm going to take you through all of the things that I've done. This is one of my 2 front pieces, and I've added interfacing to it. They've had me invisibly stitch the interfacing on this edge and then machine baste it here. And then I've pressed the facing over. I like that this is a cut-on facing because it eliminates a seam right here on this edge, which can become really bulky because you would have the seam allowance inside of it. So this is kind of the nicest way to create that front edge for a bulky fabric. I have realized that this will make it harder to bag the lining, but we're gonna get to the lining in a later video, so I'm not stressed out about that. Here's my center back. I know it looks a little crazy because it's got a raglan sleeve. This is the back neckline, and these will become part of the raglan armholes. So this again has been machine basted in, and my seam allowances on this pattern are 5/8 of an inch, and I've basted in at 3/8 of an inch. The pattern told me to trim the interfacing out at the center back seam, which I did, and then press it open. I have also taken the step, which I talked about earlier, of catch stitching my seam allowances in place. It's difficult to see because my thread is truly the exact same color as my fabric. This will hold this open. It won't ever fold in on itself, and I prefer that. It just keeps it flat over time and any wear or friction, and it's completely invisible on the exterior of the garment. This is not a necessary step unless you want to do it. I pretty much always want to do it, but consider it optional. Catch stitching is a very fast, loose stitch, so it really doesn't add that much time to your workflow. Here's my sleeve back. For this pattern, the sleeve is cut in 2 pieces, and this is the back piece. Once again, you can see that the interfacing has been machine basted into place. And then here is the sleeve front, and the pattern asked that I add this stay tape in the seam line, so at 5/8 of an inch, between 2 markings. So I've done that here, and this will prevent any stretching at all. I still need to sew this sleeve together. The pattern asked me to sew both sides, but what I have done, here's my other sleeve, is I've only sewn it up on one side, and the reason for that is we're going to apply sequins when the fabric is flat or flat-ish. I've pressed this on my ham in order to maintain the lovely curve that this sleeve piece has at the shoulder. If I were to sew the sleeve into a tube, it would be much more difficult to apply sequins, so I'm leaving it flat like this, and then later on I will close it up. And then another sleeve piece. These are my 2 cuffs, and these have the hair canvas, and it has been invisibly sewn in along one edge, and then at the other edge they had me blind stitch it. So blind stitching happens right in here, right in along here. This is not my most blind stitch. You can see these little spots where my thread comes through, and it doesn't need to be invisible in this application because it's on the inside of this cuff. The pattern has me sew these cuffs in the round, but I haven't done that yet because I haven't made the rest of the sleeve yet, so I will hold off on that until I'm ready for them. And then finally, my collar has been sewn together just at center back, and I will hold off on this until we get to the collar a little further down the road. Thank you so much for joining me today as I cut out my fabric and prepared my project for all that is to come. So let's talk about what's to come. I've got bound buttonholes, welt pockets, sequins. That's the part that I'm most excited about, obviously, because it's different, it's fun, it's creative, I get to play with materials, it's all my favorite things. I also have to make my collar, which will have pad stitching. Moving forward with this project, I'll continue to make videos that are structured like this one, where you see sort of my problem solving and my decision making as I move through the project, but I'm also going to make shorter, concise videos for certain techniques, for example, bound buttonholes and welt pockets. So while you're watching the longer video, you might say, oh, I want to like zoom in on that. I'll have that video as well so you can just see the technique sort of up close. The pace is going to pick up because once I start moving, it's going to go a little bit faster, but there's still so much work to do. In my first video in this series, I said I thought it would take 3 to 4 weeks, and that's true. That's how long it's taking me to actually sew this, but the pace of the videos will be a little bit slower because I don't want to bombard you, and I also have to edit and all of that. So we'll be moving a little bit more quickly, but I'm still going to aim to release a video every Saturday. I might drop the tutorials midweek. Let me know your thoughts on that. If you liked this video or found it helpful, please like the video, please subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions or comments or things that you know you want to see in greater detail, please drop me a comment below. I love hearing from you guys. It's been really fun chatting with you and hearing about your own coat projects. I hope to see some of them in the future. All right, I'm going to leave it there, but I will see you soon. Bye-bye.